Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Agnia Grigas, a non-resident senior fellow for the Atlantic Council, and Mr. Jack Devine, founding partner and president of the Arkin Group, which specializes in international crisis management, strategic intelligence, investigative research, and business problem solving. He is a 32-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency. Both of them will be in conversation today on Jack's book, Spymaster's Prism, The Fight Against Russian Aggression. And with that, Agnia, over to you.
Well, it's a pleasure, and thank you for joining us for your lunch hour. We're going to have a very exciting discussion with Jack Devine today, and he'll be talking about his newest book, Spymaster's Prism. In fact, it's his second book already. And I had the pleasure of reading it this weekend. I have to say it's a very fast-paced and exciting read, but it's also, heavy-duty material in terms of some of the real threats that the United States is facing and has continued to face over the past decades. One of the things that the book really emphasizes is Russia's strategic goals, which haven't changed really since the Cold War era, and really focus on undermining and weakening U.S. democratic institutions and our alliances. And Mr. Devine also emphasizes that in the United States, we have had a significant level of complacency towards Russian operations, towards Russian intelligence services, really since the end of the Cold War. So I want to kick off as soon as possible. And I want to note that after Mr. Devine's opening remarks, we will all have an opportunity to ask him questions. You will have an opportunity you can raise your hand through Zoom, or you can also submit a question through chat. So please start thinking about, or maybe you already have your questions ready, what you'd like to ask him. But to kick off, I wanted to ask Mr. Devine. So in this book, as a former spy master yourself, someone with 32 years experience in the CIA running global intelligence operations, I'm wondering, why did you choose to focus on Russia? Why did you choose Russia? Do you believe it is potentially the greatest threat to American intelligence services today, or to America's national interests? So if we can kick it off with that.
Let me do a little prelude. The reason I write books at all, right? So in the CIA, you say on the document saying, you will keep the secrets and all of that. And during most of my career, there was very little written about the CIA. I actually got interested in the CIA by a book that David Wise wrote years ago, criticizing the CIA as the military intelligence complex that was it was basically what they were calling the deep state today. I read it and had a different reaction, which was, sounds like a really interesting place. And I sent a letter in when they wrote letters with pen and ink. And lo and behold, before too long, I was in CIA and then in Santiago, Chile during the Allende years. Well, what happened over the years is more and more people wrote books. But what happened in my career is a little anomalous in that so much of it is the covert action. If you think of books, you think of James Bond as the action part, and George Smiley and the Carrés books being espionage. And in a simplistic way, the spying director, which I was in charge of in the late 90s, was really split into those two disciplines. What happens with the action part, whether it's the Shah, Guatemala, Bay of Pigs, that's the stuff that really gets into the newspapers and is controversial, and you get commissions. So I ran the program to drive the Russians out of Afghanistan in its heyday when the Stinger went in. So consequently, and I knew Rick Ames, the spy inside the CIA, there was so much that I touched that became public. It allowed me to actually put pen to paper. And then the second thing is I got tired of people talking about what took place having not even been there and not in the middle of it. And Charlie Wilson's War is an example that we can talk about that at some point. And I like Charlie and Travel, but it wasn't his war. So I thought maybe I should say something. I'm also a teacher. I taught high school for 4 years before joining the CIA. And I felt I had something to say educationally about the CIA so that people would understand it better, and particularly when to use it and when not to use it, and the mistakes that were made and the things that we can learn from it. So the book goes back from the early foundation of the CIA, but it's very contemporary, and I bounce back and forth because, as you said, it's largely about Russia and its activities. So to your question, I think everybody in the room would say, well, why not China? I mean, it's obvious that that's our main challenge. And I would say that's true if you want to talk about geopolitical, economic, military, long-term, maybe midterm challenge and threat. So what I'm really talking about here is who's meddling inside the United States, who's running intelligence operations inside the United States that make a difference. Now, the Chinese and the Russians and everybody else that has a computer is trying to collect as much intelligence as they can and penetrate as deep as they can. But from where I sit, and if you look at the solar winds expose of a little while ago, the Russians, from where I sit, seem to be deeper into the defense, intelligence, national security would be a better word, arena, and collecting. Even that, you would say, well, but the Chinese are still so powerful. The difference is, and the shocking thing for me, and I started writing in 2016, is that there was a seismic change in the 26th election on about how you do intelligence inside the United States. What are the ground rules as far as Russia is concerned? And I spent most of my time in the Cold War, but a decade after the Cold War, in this intelligence business. And we had an understanding during the Cold War. I mean, people really don't focus on this. And that is, we meddled and challenged each other around the world, but not inside Russia and not inside the United States. There might be a few examples of that that are offbeat, but by and large, that was an understanding. And we used to refer to, my predecessors referred to it as Moscow rules. And so when the Russians intervened, not only just collecting in 26, they used it, and they were, they had 470 Facebook and 2,700 Twitter accounts and reached 20. This is meddling in our system, and it's such an aberration. And what I'm concerned about today, and this is the core hypothesis here, we live in a world where when you look at nuclear weapons, you could count them and you could have treaties. We now have a cyber war that's been engaged, including in the United States, and there doesn't seem to be any rules of the road. And the Russians are now behaving more aggressively, without a question of doubt, in the utilization of intelligence than anyone else inside the United States. The Chinese actually looked at it. There was a report out recently on National Intelligence report saying that the Chinese looked at it in 2020 and getting involved in the internal politics, and they stood back. It was too risky. So this is why I'm focused on it, and I think we are right to look very seriously and put tremendous influence on China in its future. But let's not fall asleep at the switch about what's happening, and it can't be blasé. This is not what's happening. That this was not what was happening during the Cold War, and it's really important to understand this, and that's why I wrote the book.
Absolutely, and coming back to really this 2016 election, because you talk a lot about it in the book, and you also go in through detail through Mueller's report. What is your takeaway from, again, from your background as a spymaster with 32 years in the CIA? During your time in the CIA, could you have imagined such an operation? Was this something much beyond the scale that you had previously seen? You had said already this has broken the Moscow rules in terms of no direct engagement in American domestic politics. But can you give us a little bit more of your assessment on the 2016 election operation?
I wasn't shocked that they were penetrating, collecting information inside our political process. I wasn't shocked by it. As I said earlier, I was shocked by the fact that they used it. But what was interesting, if you look at the Mueller report, what happens, everyone gets focused on the political side and our own political affairs, and we're looking at collusion. the real story is what are the Russians doing? And the report documents pretty clearly two things. They were running around in the human world trying to find sources and recruit. It's very detailed in the report. And it's the type of thing that I probably participated myself around the world when a new government comes in and you weren't ready and you try and find sources. But as I said, the part that was different, and I didn't believe it at first. I thought, well, maybe some mid-level Russian general did it or somewhere else along the line. And that it was, they got off and it got bigger than they thought and they were dabbling. But the further I got away from it, the more egregious it seemed, because there's a strategy, and you're probably much more familiar with it, Agnia, than I am, but it's the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Russia in 2014 put forth a strategy. It's online, you can read it. It's not like it's a hidden secret strategy. It's called the hybrid strategy. And what it includes in there is when you have an adversary or a potential adversary, and that's the problem with Putin for a minute. He still sees us as an adversary. I don't believe we should be, but if you start with that premise, we fit in the category of what they would consider adversaries or potential adversaries. And what they say is you need to use, in the modern age, as part of the warfare, you need to unsettle the political system of your adversary. You need to weaken them through disinformation, through cyber. And when I'm writing in the book, I go back through many of the cases in the past that are being retreaded now, but they're harnessed to cyber warfare. So I think when I look at the 2016 election, there's the election part, but there's really, have we entered into, and I think the answer to me is more affirmative than not, have we entered into a Cold War? I mean, are we going to continue to see meddling in our internal affairs? And then the big question, which someone surely will ask, is, well, what do you do about it, right? So, and I think we're in the process of seeing that happen. I mean, the theme of the book is spiked in the past week because of the President of the United States has put a whole set of new sanctions in against the Russians. The Russians are reciprocating. So the dynamics are surely there. And for me, it starts with, not that it starts, there were many other signs, as you were saying earlier, Agnia, of the Russian intentions. But the meddling in the internal affairs, politically getting involved in the United States, was a no-no in the Cold War. And I don't know if people realize that. I think there's an assumption from too many movies and TV that the CIA runs around wild inside of Russia and they run around inside the United States causing trouble. That just isn't a reality.
Since the 2016 election, have there been any other pinpoints for you or highlights that have particularly concerned you with where this relationship is going between the US and Russia, and continuous Moscow rules that have been broken? And how would you assess again, at the recent event which you touched on, how would you assess Biden's administration's response, these current sanctions, to Russia's again meddling in the 2020 elections, and of course the cyber attacks on SolarWinds, and the bounties, let's say, on American soldiers? Do you think this is more of the same, or are we seeing more of an escalation really since 2016?
I'm not sure it's an escalation. I wouldn't say that, but I would say there's clearly been a continuation of meddling in the political affairs of in the United States in the 2020 election. But it was more it wasn't as much in the cyber field, although there was surely enough of it. But and they may be feeling that they've already created enough problems for us. They're not the source of all of them, right? But they certainly contributed. We've been arguing and fighting and impeachments and hearings over what they did. So I don't think they ever imagined it would have the impact that it did. So they overachieved. But if you match that up with their meddling in Europe, their position in Ukraine, the other reason the president went forward with sanctions is, they're rattling the sabers on the border. There's a series of articles. I mean, the Italians wrap up a group of KGB officers operating there. The Bulgarians, this is in the last 2 weeks. And yesterday I'm reading that two of the people that were involved in one of the assassination attempts in London is now being looked at the Czech Republic because of a dump that was blown up on purpose because they were supplying weapons to Ukrainians. I mean, there's a lot of bad behavior. It makes some of the Cold War activities look sort of mild. People, again, it's disoriented when you see assassinations in movies. Oh yeah, it happens all the time. CIA bumping off people, KGB. It just isn't, it wasn't true as far as the CIA is concerned. We can talk about the Church Commission, but in truth, it's really hard to say who was ever bumped off by the CIA. But the KGB, had it, but it was even during the Cold War, it was fairly limited. But we've looked at a series of assassination been attributed to the GRU and by various countries. And you have to scratch your head and say, what's going on? So there's a lot of very Cold War activity. There was this famous spy, and I'll go to your question about the most recent incident. There was a famous spy in New York City, Comrade J, and I go into this in the book. And he signed up with the CIA, if that's what you want to refer to it, but as a young man. And then when he came out in 2004, he said, what's interesting? When I joined, the number one target was the United States. The number two target was NATO. Number three was China. And when I come out in 2004, the number one is United States. Number two is NATO. Number three is China. In other words, we're viewed as their number one as of 2004. But I just thought the time sequence. So I think there's been a series of activities I've mentioned. Navalny, I mean, the human rights issues involved. You have the solar winds, deep penetration into our most sensitive, not the most sensitive information, but the most sensitive entities in the national security arena. So, we've seen a string of these activities. So the Biden administration has levied, they threw people out, they've increased the sanctions. And they're dealing with sovereign wealth and going and taking steps to limit the ability to trade in rubles. This is a serious reaction. Now, in the book, I talk about the Spymaster president, and that's Putin. I mean, I don't think I'll be the first one. I'm sure the White House has a good grip on it. He's not going to roll over. I mean, that just isn't his personality if you read any writings about him. So there'll be some response. And the question is, can we somehow get it back, the genie back in the box? So I'm supportive of the initiatives in light of what I've just said and why I've written a book. I think some actions have to be taken place. There's one statement in the response or the initiative by the Biden administration, which says, and carry out unseen activities. Now, in America, this is really hard to swallow because, I lived in a secret world and I know how hard it is for Americans to live with secret intelligence services and secret activities. Fortunately, in democracy, and I'm an advocate for it, we have Senate oversight and congressional oversight. And this is a good thing. But Americans, George Washington had an intelligence group, and Lincoln did, and Roosevelt, and they all were dissolved. CIA wasn't a natural outflow of World War II. There was almost nothing happening until the Cold War and Iron Curtain, and CIA was created. And it's really been only in this modern era that we've had intelligence. So when a president says, well, I'm going to take unseen activities, I think it addresses or goes to the problem of cyber. How do you talk about it? How do people understand it? So this is a very tricky business. And I think it's right. I'm not saying that's what we're doing. I don't know. But it seems if they're acting inside our country in the cyber area, if you're going to respond in kind, ipso facto, you're going to have to respond in some cyber arena. And I say again, I'm not saying it shouldn't be done by any means, but everyone has to know what we're doing, and that is we are now punch and counter punch situation. So diplomacy, and I don't mean necessarily the group of seven or somebody getting around talking about cyber, but there have to be very private, unseen discussions that talk about what we will not do. No sense wasting your time saying what we are going to do. But let's agree on certain things we won't do. And I put number one at the top. We're not going to meddle in the internal affairs of our country. And I would say the same thing should apply to China. But you have to get those agreements. They're not it's apparently not easily done. And the reason, and I'm going to stop on this, I think we really need to understand Putin's mindset to understand why it's so hard to make this happen.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up to questions to the audience. And because we're a pretty small group, I can say that you can also unmute yourself and simply ask the question. So if there's, please.
This is Bill Loomis. Jack, can you hear me?
Yes, but I can tell you're from New York, at least part of the time.
I'm in Santa Barbara. Anyway, so I have two questions, three actually. What is on that wooden sign to your left?
Okay, I got it. I'll handle that.
Okay, and the second question is, can you share with them the story about when we invaded Haiti again? I read in the New York Times that you threatened the chief of police in Port-au-Prince.
I never threatened him.
No, I know that. You're going to tell that story.
He just felt
And
it.
the last one is any comments about the Wuhan lab? Thank you.
Yeah, the first two are fun. The last one, not so much. So it wasn't my intent, but in order to get lighting, so there's two things on the wall here. And both of them, actually there's three things. And I was explaining this to Agnia and Ashley earlier that are within hand's reach. So I don't collect toys, right? I'm not a toy collector. But this is a replica of a truck that was used inside of Pakistan to move weapons when I was in charge of the program. All three items were given to me by Charlie Wilson, the famous congressman. And we were, professionally you can't be friends, right? But we were friendly for sure. And after he left, I traveled with him to to Pakistan and other places in the Middle East. We got to know him quite well. And when he retired, we had dinner up in New York, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We talk about Charlie. But one of them is a quote from Kipling, and it says, "And go to your God like a soldier," and that's Kipling. And if you know what that is, it's the British soldier falls on the ground, and while he's dying, he can hear the Afghan women coming to do whatever they're going to do in terms of cut off his jewelry or whatever, and basically shoot yourself. So it's a pretty grim end to Afghanistan. So this is maybe not the right week for that one. The one above it, which I referred to often, is a quote from Abdur Khan, and this is he was the first modern Afghan president in the late 1800s, and it says something like, his last words to his son, my son, whatever you do, my last piece of it, never trust the Russians. So that's what you're referring to. So again, we're going to be all over the board. Haiti has really nothing to do whatsoever with Russia, but I was in charge of Latin America, and this was in the Clinton administration. And what people don't realize in the Clinton administration, what a world we lived in, and we could go back to the threats. The two biggest threats were concerns were two islands, Ireland and Haiti. And again, you have to go back, but these were big domestic issues in that election. So he promised he would put the president back in that was democratic elected and ousted by the military. So this is the short version, right? The short version is eventually the NSC called me and said, look, Jack, go down there and tell the chief of police to get out of town. And if not, the US military is going to take him out of town. Now, I reworded it a little bit, but the point was we were going to invade Haiti in the early days of the administration. So I did go down, and you could question my wisdom, but I actually knew, I had a pretty good idea what my risks were. But I went down by myself to go sit down with the chief of police in a friendly house. And unbeknownst to me, there was a cook in there who was going to bring out some food. And they brought out a bowl of pumpkin soup for each of us. And the problem with pumpkin soup is, in many parts of Latin America, if you want to poison somebody, traditionally you put it in pumpkin soup because of the taste. I thought he was going to die. He just froze. Now I had known, because we had an intelligence report beforehand saying that he went to the voodoo doctor. Espionage can be quite interesting, I will point out, covert action. And he had some white powder thrown on him to keep the evil spirits away. So I did say to him, look, I've come here to help you get out of here in a good and high style, or this is not going to end well. And I left, and he stayed. And a week later, the planes took off from Florida. Before they could land, and before our troops could land, some of the Haitian forces were turning themselves in, and the generals left. So he got on the radio, and this is what you're referring to, Bill. I should have saved it. I really was, just too busy with what I was doing to save it. And he got on the radio and said, they sent down this big, scary guy who threatened to kill me, my wife, and my children. And I just wanted you to know that that never happened. I might have looked like it, but that never happened. I went down there and gave him sound advice about what really was going to happen and when it was going to happen. And I'm going to half punt because I enjoyed that story. I don't care if anyone else did. I guess it's egocentric. And yeah, I'd forgotten all about it. But the Wuhan situation, where the virus started, I think we're going to be struggling with this for a long, long time about where and how it started. I have no definitive information on that. I do think it will remain a scar on the relationship with China and how when history looks back at it, and the over 500,000 Americans that are dead and many around the world. So I think, or 500,000 affected, but the point is, a pandemic, and we've just lived through it. So I don't think it was intentional. Let me clarify that. I don't think, even though all countries have a capacity to, not all, major countries give us the plague, we don't do it because hopefully for some moral core, but there's a practical reason, which is once you release it, you don't know who's going to die, and all your people could be wiped out. So there is some mutual destruction in biochemistry. But if a person disoriented or a country mentally becomes psychologically damaged, then there are real risks. So I'm going to punt on that. And Bill, you got 3 questions, Bill. So
Jack. So I want to go back to the second one. So you left out the key thing, which the New York Times said that you threatened to kill the chief of police in Port-au-Prince. And you told me that instead, what you did was you went down with your big Irish police face, and he got the message. And that was so important. In other words, you just looked at him and he said, yeah, okay, I get it.
So I see we have 2 questions. We have one from David, and then we have one from Philip. So David and then Philip, please.
To be continued, Bill.
Sure. Question related to cyber and cybersecurity. American companies are generally advised to take a defensive stance, but not to respond aggressively to sort of the relentless cyber attacks, some of which are, individuals or, private groups, some of which are state sponsored. And I'm wondering if that's good advice, or given the technical capabilities that many of our large companies have. And I can tell, I'm on a public company board, the amount of attention focused on cyber is is astonishing, and the attack environment is astonishing. But should American companies, in fact, be using their capabilities to create a cost for bad actors? Because, I mean, we're really advised to stay in a defensive crouch.
Yeah, David, this is an excellent question, truly an excellent question, because it really hits on a couple different concepts that are really important. Most of our national security infrastructure is in the hands of the private sector. In other words,
Right.
The private sector controls it. When you're talking about China, Russia, that isn't the case. You know, they can centralize and control the response. So, and they control the apparatus that would be attacked. So the beauty of our country is we have a system that allows entrepreneurship, stocks, investment, but it leads to decentralization, which decentralization, again, from a democratic point of view, remember my civics, this is a pretty good place to be, and I wouldn't want to change it. The problem is, how does a democratic government work in unison in a concerted way against a nation state that's using the same vehicles and protecting themselves in the same way? So I think it's one of those things that is a real dilemma. And I think my response would be the same one that you're getting the advice from the national security arena, which is don't respond, harden yourself as much as you can. Okay, so I'm with that.
Mhm.
But I don't think that's not the whole story. Your government can't tell you that and say, well, that took care of that. They have to say, well, what are we going to do about it now? How do we respond? And that's what I was referring to earlier. In other words, if we're not in a position to organize ourselves, you can't have one company hitting here arbitrarily, another one's there. You can start, some war. Look, we're going to take the grid out. So it has to be controlled. Government control, oversight is really important in these sorts of issues, and that's why we do centralize our armed forces in the military. So I'm saying, yes, and we're going to need, if we're going to do something, we're going to need, and we do have a lot of cooperation with the private sector. But what I was getting at earlier is we have the capability and to really respond in force in cyber. I think we could match anybody. But we have, and I'm not really casting aspersions here on every politician in the country. It's just a hard problem, and we have to understand it. It's very hard for us to come to a consensus about how to deal with it. And it's a question of, are we going, because we're not, as far as I know, as far as I can tell, it's uncharted water where we're going to go respond. If they take out one of our companies, and how do we respond? So I'm saying, if I were recapping, I'd say our government has to respond. It's better that the private sector toughen itself, cooperate with the government. But then I would say to my government friends, but that it does require a response now. I mean, we have to have some rules of the road. And the great dilemma is you can't have this debate out in public. No one's going to sit down and admit what they're doing. So you have this goes to my point, private. So I'm hopeful that our government is moving in that direction, but I've seen up to date, isn't visible to me, unseen, that we're responding to, we're not responding in exactly kind. We are responding. I applaud the responses. I think they're appropriate. But we're not responding in kind. They're meddling in our system. That's my Jack Devine's fundamental point. They're meddling in our system, and we're trying to figure out how do we respond without sparking Cold War II. And I think we're probably right up near the edge.
It's an interesting challenge, because much of our national security operations actually are run by private sector companies. And so there's a continuum. I mean, they're purely private sector companies that if you're attacked, you're attacked. But, if you're Parsons and you're running, cybersecurity centers for the U.S. government and you're attacked, they're attacking the U.S. government, just not directly.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying you have to have a consolidated position, policy position inside the government, how to respond to that.
Thank you.
And we have a hard time, harder than ever, not harder than ever, but certainly harder in modern times to get a consensus to do.
Someone's,
Not
yes.
me.
That was me.
Yes.
Sorry.
Okay, you were
So-
called by the counterintelligence people for your question.
That's right. It looked like a Moscow zip code.
Yeah, they're going to. You're getting another polygraph. So I again, I think I'm pointing up an issue, and but I'm not. It's not like, oh, is everybody asleep? It's a really difficult thing to get their hands around. But David, you're talking about it as a real problem. It's so much of this is in the private sector, and private sector is part of the national security. So are we going to look at their comparable part and take a shot at it? And you really, people have to be very careful about misjudging each other. So I don't envy those that have to do it, but I do believe it has to get done.
And we have a question from Philip as well, right?
Yes, thank you. I wonder what your thoughts are about a theory that the Russians are in some ways overextending themselves. In addition to having problems close to home in Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and perhaps elsewhere, they're doing a lot to prop up Venezuela. They're developing a naval base in Sudan. They continue to get deeper and more deeply involved in the Middle East. And one senior American diplomat has suggested that let them go, let them do it. They're going to bankrupt themselves. What do you think of that?
Well, I don't like the last strategy, but let me come to the beginning. So when you look at Russia, I mean, I think it's important to reflect on the fact that it has a GDP of somewhere between Spain and Italy in its size. I mean, this is not the Soviet Union, certainly not China. They're punching well above their weight. And I mean, look what they did took the Crimea. They went in, took half of, at least a third of Ukraine. They have a port in Syria. They're very heavily involved in Syria. They're mucking around in Iran and Venezuela. So your point is they're extending themselves. And I want to come back to this, this Spymaster's Prism. I'm not the only one that has a Spymaster's Prism. I'm really, I said the Spymaster President chapter has a quote under it. And it says, there is no such thing as an ex-KGB officer. Vladimir Putin, what he's telling you is he's not on the payroll of KGB by any means, but he's thinking with a Cold War mentality about what he experienced in Dresden when the Soviet Union collapsed, and he wants old Russia back. Forget communism, he wants Russia back. He wants a powerful country, a nationalistic country, and it drives him. But part of that mindset is that we are an implacable adversary. So why is he doing this? I think he's quite effective tactically. I just think he has a bad strategy. That strategy is to bring back the Cold War, weaken all the countries around you, meddle in Eastern Europe, get warm water ports, and then every time you see a place to hit a button where the US has an interest, push it. And that to me is not where we should be. Russia doesn't have communism. There's no big ideological divide. We should reset. And I've agreed with the last couple of administrations, try and reset. But I lived in Argentina, and my wife showed me how to do the tango. But one thing, you can't do it by yourself. I mean, the ugliest dance is a single person tango. And our problem is we're trying to reset. We're trying to get a dance going with Putin, and he's not a bit interested. So he has to come, there has to be some soul searching. So going back to your question though, Philip, there is a limit. They are using more of their GDP, and their economy is tied to, oil prices, right? There is some fissures in the system. There's going to be demonstrations later this month that I think we have to watch very carefully. I think Putin is entrenched, and he can handle about where he is. If I were him, I'd worry if a big one came up. It was a big problem, and I have to put a lot of resources on it. He may not have room to bring it together. And it's not cost free, guns and butter. I mean, yeah, some of the butter goes. So there is some of the discontent, I think, inside Russia. I said, I think he has a hand. Anyone thinks that he's going to go in a big hurry, although I put a qualifier in there that all autocrats are much more vulnerable in the age of cyber and social media, because once it starts to unravel, in the old days, a tyrant or an autocrat or a non-democratic leader could use an iron fist. In this day and age, if an autocrat comes to fall apart, you can wake up the next morning and see a complete change. So I think
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you for the questions. Do we have a final question from anyone? Otherwise, I would ask my final question to start our closing remarks. Well, and I think we've also, if we have a few minutes afterwards, and you still have some questions, you can probably stay on and have a chat. But my question is, and to the point you were making of a potential reset, but I'm wondering, to what extent do you think kind of a reset or an understanding between, a democratic country such as the United States and authoritarian countries are possible? And I would push even further, to what extent do you think democratic countries such as the United States are in some ways at a disadvantage when in global competition today with authoritarian countries such as Russia or China? Again, given that, one of the lessons you note in the book is that, Russia has a long strategic horizon. We have 4-year election cycles. We are a more open, more penetrable society. Our economy is much more penetrable. Just also from the questions we've received, we can hear that where, American businesses can be, targets daily of, foreign entities and don't have the same capacity to respond. So looking forward to what you think the United States is up to the task, really, and our CIA is up to the task as that of a democratic country to, battle the intelligence services of, Russia and China going forward.
Right. So I'm fully confident. I mean, I think we've got the best military, bar none, around the world. I also believe our intelligence capabilities are unmatched, and I believe that's true in cyber. Okay, we can all argue about it, but I think we have the capacity. Remember what I said about the hybrid strategy, and we can't fluff it off. Part of an enemy's strategy is to weaken your political process and system. All right, we're not talking about destabilizing, overthrowing the government. How do you weaken? It's a very clever strategy. So I think we have the capacity. Do we have an agreed upon national security strategy? Bipartisan. Bipartisan really key. And when I was through the Cold War, 90% of what I was involved in had strong bipartisan support, and people have forgotten those days. So I think we have the capacity. We do have a political problem, and it confronts itself and presents itself in several different ways that have come up in the discussion. One of the huge advantages of the Cold War, when I was operating and trying to win friends and influence people, was I had a great product. America, a land of opportunity. You can come here without a shirt in your back, and you can go on to become, a prominent businessman, and your son or daughter can become president of the United States. That's still true. I mean, you can argue all you want, but when you look around the world, in the eyes of people abroad, it is still a very powerful product. So when you talk about, are we up to responding? The poor Russian, the Soviets in the Cold War, try and sell communism as a vision of the future in 1980, right? We're going to put you in gulags, and we're going to have communes, and we're going to have large factories with nothing going on. I mean, it was a terrible product to sell, and I felt sorry. I don't want my CI people calling me and investigate me, but they had a terrible product. They had to work really hard. So I think we're still there. That one of the problems China is going to have isn't that it's going to be able to sell and provide aid and loans and all that. You're going to have to sell people that you want a country like China, totally Communist Party, if you don't appreciate that it's a real communist country, a lot of us pretend, not me, let me stand back. A lot of capital in America felt it was just a facade. But look at read the Communist Party, read what they're doing. So I think that we have a really strong advantage in terms of what we're trying to bring to the world. And I think that's strong. And I think this country is very rich in its resources, people, and so on. I do think there's a political disadvantage, but there's great strength in democracy and being able to release the air through, we might not like the debates and we may not like the hearings, but it is a very good process. But I think we've lost an appreciation of looking at the national security interest and less from our personal interest or political party interest, but what's really good. And then I think if we straighten that out, and I think we've been in cycles before, but then I think we're in a really strong place. We don't have to spend, it's not that we have to raise more money so we can match Russia's cyber, or that we need to, develop some special capabilities. And modern technology, a lot of you are very familiar with, it comes out of the innovative labs of this country and financial institutions. So I'm optimistic, but I would be misleading everybody if I didn't tell you that I do recognize there is a political problem, which is very satisfying to our adversaries.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Devine. Excellent points, and I really agree. We have the product, as you say. We have an excellent product that we can still kind of sell with that soft power across the world. We have the capabilities, probably the strongest capabilities. But as you highlight, maybe one thing we're lacking right now is that political will, political agreement, and really a bipartisan agreement, as you discussed. Thank you.
I think it's doable with men and women of good heart on that. So I think it's within our ability to do it. Well, thank you very much. I was out once before to the Pacific Council
Jack?
in person, and it was great. And keep up your good work of educating.
Jack?
Well, thank you so much. So I think this wraps up our formal part of the discussion. And I think if some folks want to stay on and chat with the author, I think that would probably be possible, right, Ashley?
Indeed, that is fine.
I will take a couple, but I have to run. But let's say until 4 o'clock, I'm good. Okay, if somebody is shy and didn't want to do it in front of everybody, I'm bashful too. Ashley and Agnia, thank you so much. You were very gracious, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate
so much,
that.
Jack. Thank you.
And Bill, thanks for flagging it, and someday we'll get to share that story.
Okay, well, if nobody has any other questions, I am going to end the program for today. Thank you all so much for joining us. And if anyone does have any further questions, you can feel free to send me an email and I can connect you.
Thank you so much, Agnia.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.